So the last 3 or so weeks, we've been making our way through a gospel account or an eyewitness account, a good news account that Mark, as probably dictated to him by Peter, tells us of his encounter with Jesus and the life of Jesus. And if you were to summarize where we've come from so far, you could say this. Mark jumps right into this by saying Jesus was no ordinary man. He was the king of the universe. He was divine Messiah, and that's who came. And then Mark's going to spend about the next half of his gospel account, his good news account, just giving evidence of that very truth, that Jesus was not an ordinary man. He was God in a human body. The second thing that Mark wants us to know is that the story of Jesus is about an event. It's not advice. There's actually an event that happened on a fateful and fantastic weekend in Jerusalem, and Mark wants us to grasp that. Unlike any other faith, which essentially comes down to advice, this is not advice. This is the effects and the power of an event that happened, and that's what he presents so far. Then last weekend, Russell took us through what is a bit of an unfolding of Jesus' worldview, of how he sees the world. And how you see the world is such a powerful thing. How we envision things is actually how we live. How we see the world around us is how we interact with it. How do you see the world? What's it look like? Is it a dominantly good place? Or is it a place filled with darkness and threat? And how do you see the world? I want to start by taking us to Calcutta, India, to a little 5'0" Albanian nun named Mother Teresa. You've heard of her, you bet. Mother Teresa and her group of fellow nuns had this practice of every day taking a bus down to the local train station where overnight families who couldn't care for their sick would drop off their sick, actually abandon their sick, because rumor had it that Mother Teresa would come and take care of them. On one such occasion where Mother Teresa and her fellow nuns went down to the local train station, she came across an elderly man who was near death, dehydrated, malnourished. He had open sores in his body that were being consumed by, things you don't want to consume, have your body consumed by. And Mother Teresa noticed him for some reason, and she arranged to take him back to the monastery, and there for the rest of the day, she cared for him. She tried to keep him cool, gave him whatever nutrition he was able to take in, but she stayed by his bedside till mid-afternoon when he opened his eyes and said thank you, and he died. Later that evening over dinner, Mother Teresa's fellow nuns made a comment to her that she seemed unusually present and unusually positive, and there was a glow and a demeanor about her, and they knew how she had spent her day and that the one that she had cared for had died. And so they asked her, what is this about? Like, why are you filled with this sense of contentment and joy in spite of what you face? And she said this, she said, I have spent the afternoon caring for the Christ. I spent the afternoon and I watched the Christ die. What was she saying with that? She was, I think, thinking about Matthew 25, where Jesus says, when you've done for the least of them what you do that for me. This was her view. This is how she saw the world. This is how she saw the sick and the dying and the destitute and the marginalized. How you see the world has a huge impact on what you do in this world. And that was Mother Teresa's view. She was uneducated, had no wealth, had no political power that had been conferred on her, and yet she made a deep impact in this world. Winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. She would see a dying beggar. This was her worldview. While others people saw, and parents and families saw, a body they couldn't care for to be discarded, she didn't discard. She embraced and came to that dying beggar. She would be with presidents and potentates and powerful people. And rather than be impressed with their power, she would speak often of how clear it was to her they desperately needed a savior as well. She would see street children and orphans. And when she saw them, she saw children of God. This was her worldview. This is how she saw the world, and it impacted what she did in the world. Vision always precedes action. But when I use the word vision, I don't think like a corporate vision statement or even our church vision statement you might post on the wall or put on a website. I mean the word vision in the way the Bible uses the term vision. When the Bible refers to vision, it refers to actual eyesight, how you actually see the world you live in, how you think about the world, what it looks like to you. It's what vision is in the Bible, and that determines actions in the world. And the reason I bring that up is I believe that's what Mark is trying to communicate to us in these early chapters of what Jesus' view of the world was, how he thought about the world. And he thought about it different than any contemporary in his day. He might well think of it different than you and I do as well. But how he thought of the world impacted what he did in the world and how he addressed it. It was just radically different, and it was uncomfortable, and it made people afraid, and they pushed back on him. But yet it was a wonderful view of the world, and it remains a wonderful view. So what exactly was Jesus' view of the world? Well, I believe this is what Mark is trying to point out as he sat and he heard Peter tell the stories, the interaction that Peter had with Jesus. This would be recorded some 30 years after the events. And it's just what I want to look at with you tonight is just a powerful way of how you see Jesus look at the world and differently than how we might as well. Over the last 9 months or so, I've had lots of conversations with people, face-to-face, by phone, email, and so on. And I think I've seen a little bit of how people and myself view the world in its current state. I've had conversations with people who, when we ungathered as a church back in the middle of March, would have written and would have said that the reason we did that was because we were afraid, or we were acquiescing to government policy and government directives because we just lacked the courage to stand up. We were afraid. And that was their view of decisions that we made. I hear this: if we don't elect the right president or the right party, this country and the church and even Christianity itself will be under attack, and it'll mean the demise of the church. I hear this: there are too many weak and apathetic Christians who refuse to stand up and fight and simply give in to the darkness and political saboteurs. I hear this: this is the start of the apocalypse, the end of time. Disasters, wars, rumors of wars, hate, dysfunction, racial partisanship, this is the end. And all of those reflect how people see the world, what's happening today, in the way they describe it, in their fear and their concern. And then obviously the question is, so what do we do about it? And often the response is along these lines: we need to be bolder and more courageous, and we need to publicly stand up to the evil forces at play in our world. Sort of like a Christian nationalism. Or it's this: the church needs to teach the Bible's moral code and go back to teaching against moral slippage and doctrinal impurity and judgment of the unfaithful, back to a measurable code of conduct of Christian morality. All of these reflect how we see the world when this is how we interact on it. And a case could be made for some of those comments, it really could be, and some of the solutions. But in some way, I find myself unconvinced that that is how we should see the world. I find myself unconvinced that's how Jesus sees the world. Nor is that Jesus' solution, I suspect, as well. And what you have at play here and what Mark writes is a picture of what Jesus' worldview is, and I think it applies to us as well. I wonder if possibly we do not see our world the way Jesus does, and as a result, we do not live in it the way Jesus would. I wonder if in this next section from Mark's eyewitness account, Mark and Peter are not doing for their generation what we need in our generation. In today's section of Mark's gospel, he tells 4 stories in really rapid succession. And they really are helpful to show how Jesus saw the world, and especially how he saw it differently than his friends or the religious leaders of his day. And I would guess that if we did a little self-reflection, a little thinking together, about how differently he sees it, we might actually see we don't see it like he does either. So how did he see it? First story. Jesus encounters a man collecting taxes beside the Sea of Galilee, and where his fellow Jewish citizens saw Matthew, the person collecting taxes, as a treasonous person, somebody that was worse than a sinner, if you can be worse than a sinner. Matthew had been booted out of the synagogue, out of the Jewish faith. He was anathema to people. He had nothing to do with him. In fact, the record, if you want to read it yourself in Mark, says, Jesus is asked, why do you hang out with such scum? That's how Matthew was seen. But Jesus' view was what? Matthew is fully redeemable. Matthew was not a lost cause. Matthew was worth embracing. Matthew was worth investing in. Matthew was worth, of all things, included in the 12 that would reshape the whole world, including you and me. That's how Jesus saw it. See, he just saw it differently, radically differently. And it didn't make sense to the people who lived next to him and saw how he saw the world, because that's the thing. If you don't see the world like Jesus sees the world, how he sees it doesn't make sense. And this is now the beginning of what Mark, I think, is trying to reveal. It tells us a second story. He tells us about some people who noticed that Jesus and his group of guys don't do religious fasting like they had been taught. You see, as good Jews, there were good regulations that were very, very clear about how one was supposed to abstain from certain things, certain foods, how often that was to happen, the occasions it was to happen. And all of it was, well, frankly, it was done to show how pious they were, that they could show off how long they could go, how often they could do it, how much they could abstain, so that others would look at those who did that and participate and respect who they were as people. Jesus, on the other hand, saw fasting so much different than that. It really wasn't about giving up something. It was rather about approaching God in the sense of saying, look at the King of all the universe is now present, and we don't have to abstain in that. We have to enjoy his presence because the King is here. And this is what Jesus tries to say. The real power of abstaining from something is that it's good for the human soul when it's done out of love and admiration and celebration of God's wonderful goodness of who he is. That's how Jesus saw it. And they didn't see it the same way as that. Third story, Mark points out another, even more sacred ceremony than fasting. It's the whole area of the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a practice very, very sacred to the Jewish people. The idea had been handed down from Moses, who, when God visited Moses, gave him 10 commandments. The fourth one was that his followers should keep the Sabbath holy and recognize it. But it wasn't long before that got kind of turned around a little bit, and the Sabbath became much more than its intended purpose. It wouldn't be long before it morphed into an onerous list of some 39 different categories, not just 39 things, 39 categories of things you could not do on the Sabbath. And rather than being the refreshing and renewing idea, which was what God had intended it for, it was simply this: why don't you take a day off and be refreshed and renewed, and stop working at the things that supply your needs. Let God supply the needs. Let him do that. And so Jesus comes along and says this. He says, the Sabbath was made for you, not you for the Sabbath. It just had a different view, and it was almost turning to the religious leaders of a day and saying, like, all that Sabbath-keeping stuff you do, stop it. Don't do that stuff anymore till you get the reason why you would do it. Right, first of all. But if that's such an anchor to the religious system, just like for us a moral code can be, or biblical doctrine that is measurable, and you have to do this, and you have to go to church, and you have to give, and you have to do all those things, it all gets lost in its purpose. And Jesus comes along and goes, just stop it then. Just stop it. Get it right at the inner part of your life. And this is what Jesus was trying so hard to communicate, that he just saw the Sabbath differently. And they didn't really know what to do with Jesus when he did that. This whole idea of how Jesus sees the world differently culminates in the fourth story, and I want to read this one to you. The other three appear to set this one up. So ingrained in the minds of people was the idea of doing religious acts to earn the good graces of God through fasting and Sabbath keeping, that Mark shares another Sabbath-keeping incident, and he kind of amps it up a little bit. And this is how he tells the story in Mark chapter 3, verse 1. He says, Jesus went into the synagogue again, and he noticed. Jesus' evangelistic path. Take notice and take interest. Over and again, you see that do. And on this particular occasion, he goes to the synagogue, and he sees a man with a deformed hand. Well, since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. Now, there's a worldview, right? There's a view of Jesus. Suspect him, question him, doubt him. Their fear of Jesus' growing influence in what to them was total disregard for the rules and good doctrine and theology makes them feel like they're not in control, and that's so clouded their vision that they see Jesus as an enemy, and they've lost all compassion for this disabled man in the synagogue. They don't even notice him. But Jesus' worldview is that's what he notices. He notices this man. But he knows this. If he healed the man's hand, he knew that they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath and defiling the Sabbath. Jesus' worldview was compassion for this man and concern for the misguided view of these hyper-religious people. So Jesus, in compassion, said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." Then he turned to his critics and he asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath? Or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or to destroy it?" Jesus' view that this was not a contrast between doing something good and saving life or doing nothing and ignoring the opportunity, but rather his view was this is between saving life and death. To do nothing for this deformed-handed man was like death. Jesus, on the other hand, wanted to bring life. And so when he asked them this question, it says they wouldn't answer him. It doesn't say that they couldn't answer him or they couldn't formulate a response. It's just they wouldn't answer him. And here's why. The lens through which they saw the world had taken away their ability to be compassionate for others who were not in agreement with their view of the world. Well, they saw the man as deserving of his handicap because they believed this: someone had sinned, either this man or his parents or grandparents, and so he was deserving of this. That's how they saw it. You cannot be compassionate if that's your worldview. But here's the God of the whole universe with them saying, no way. He matters. I'm going to bring life and I'm going to bring healing to him. What a different worldview that is, right? Both acting out of their worldview. It says that Jesus' response was he looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. Yep, angry. It says angry. He was actually angry. To take the Greek word, he was livid, teeth clenched, angry at them. That's what it says. It's the kind of frustration you feel when your teenage child defies you and ignores your warnings and just does their own thing. You know about that, don't you? For sure. But it also says that he was saddened. Actually, the Greek word would be that he was grieved. It meant this: if you've ever lost someone that you love and you care deeply and there's deep sadness over that, that's how sad Jesus was here. So he's angry, teeth clenched angry, but he's also deeply saddened and sorrowful and grieving over what? Over their worldview, over how they see the world. Their hearts have become hardened by their view of the world. And Jesus is deeply concerned about that. They're blind to the worldview that Jesus has. Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. We almost shake our heads in dismay at how blind and unresponsive these hyper-religious people are. But it actually gets worse. This is how hard their hearts are and how spoiled their eyesight is. The 6th verse says, "At once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot to kill Jesus." Now, I don't know about you, I shake my head a little bit. Hold on just a second. Plot to kill Jesus over a tiff, over a handicapped guy, whether he gets healed or not? Like, go out and kill him over that? He just did a really great thing. He did a fantastic thing in that man's life. But they go out and they begin to plot to kill him. Does that seem like overkill? I think feels like overkill to me. Not only that, but the text says that they hooked up with supporters of Herod. What was that all about? Well, supporters of Herod were known as Herodians, and this was the era, as we know in Jewish history, where the Roman Empire had subjugated the nation of Israel. And the way the Romans governed these territories that they took over, they looked for local citizens to come and join them, people of influence, to join Caesar to look after, manage, and lead the people in those territories they had taken over. Well, they find a guy by the name of Herod who's a person of influence, but it meant that Herod had to kind of give up everything Jewish. Now, he could do it kind of symbolically, and he did some things, but he really was a secular kind of person, not really all that religious, but he did what Caesar wanted him to do. Now, if you can picture this, you have the Pharisees who are legalists, follow the letter of the law. That's what they're upset with Jesus about. That's their worldview. They're so hard-hearted and their worldview is so corrupt. Who do they side with? Their enemy. A group of people who are secular, who support Caesar and support Rome, but they're so clouded, they hook up together and they go, yeah, we're going to do something. Well, we're going to kill Jesus is what we're going to do. This is the power of a worldview. How in all the world does that happen? Well, you see, they don't see the world the way Jesus does. So they don't act the way Jesus does. They're afraid. Afraid of what? Well, they're not so much afraid, I don't think, of Jesus misleading them, though there was some fear of that, and that was real. But the fear that Jesus' view of the world was right, and theirs was wrong, which meant that in spite of all the evil around them, in fact, Jesus saw the world as a God-saturated, God-present, beautiful place because he was present. It meant that their attempts to earn the favor of God through self-effort and forced piety and religious ceremony were useless. It meant they were losing control. And when you lose control, you know what you become? Afraid. They're afraid. That fear is so pronounced for them that they're ready to take Jesus out. They're ready to side with their enemy to take Jesus out. This is profound fear that comes when we feel things are out of control, and we do everything we can to try to get them back in control. And this is what they're doing. This is what we do as humans. When we fear we're not in control, or our destiny or our outcomes aren't assured and we don't know that we're going to get those, we do what we can to be back in control of things, right? This is what we do. For decades we've been told, and it proves to be true, that there are two primary responses to fear of not being in control. One of them is flight, and the other is flee. And apparently, as we see in the Pharisees, we will even betray our core values and religious beliefs and side with an enemy to assassinate our enemies in order to wrestle back control. This is how profound fear is. If the world is a dangerous and threatening place, it makes us afraid. And then we try to bring things in control. And no place is this seen more clearly than an incident just after Jesus has had his final meal with his friends, what we celebrated today. They go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, we're told, is in personal conflict with what lies ahead. He's in anguish. Anguish of the soul is what he calls it. So he goes out to this garden to pray, and promptly his friends fall asleep. He wakes them up, they fall asleep, you get the story, right? And at some point, Judas arrives with a band of soldiers to betray Jesus with a friend's kiss and to have Jesus arrested. And as they're about to lead Jesus away after handcuffing him or whatever they did, we're told this in Matthew 26:51. But one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest, Malchus was his name, the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. We're going to find out from John that who this was is Peter. Interesting how Peter in his dictation to Mark never identifies, it tells the story, just never identifies himself as that person. His buddy John does that for him. Yeah. You know, we cannot fault Peter for what he does because it's a natural response to fear with the instinct to fight, to get back under control. Peter did not want this to happen to his friend, right? That makes sense. And Peter's first response is, this is out of control. Jesus is going to get arrested. He said that he's going to die. I'm going to take control of this. I'm going to seize this back. I'm going to fix this. So out of a need to control, fear prompts him to do a violent thing. And Peter chooses to fight because he's going to bring this under control. But that's not successful, right? We read this a little bit later in verse 56 of the same chapter. But this is all happening to fulfill the words of the prophets as recorded in the scriptures. At this point, underline this, at this point, all the disciples deserted him and fled. We tried fighting, and now we're going to flee. The two responses to fear when things are out of control. Peter sees the world as a place that is evil and darkness reigns, and his friend and Savior are being taken away, and if Jesus is right, taken away to die. How do you respond when you're faced with fear and uncertain times and things that create worry? What do you do? Don't you want to be in control? Don't you want to, wouldn't you like to just fix this pandemic? Wouldn't you just like to take control of that and figure that out and for it to just go away? Wouldn't you like to rig the election and make that thing turn out the way you want it to turn out? This is us. And when we are faced with these uncertain times, because it doesn't feel like it's in our control, we fight, we try to take dominance over, or we flee and we just remove ourselves from it. How much of that is because we have ourselves a settled worldview that this is a dangerous and a threatening place? When that happens, when that's our dominant worldview, our tendency is to turn to God and to promise to serve more, give more, behave better, do more, in exchange for Him to protect us, provide, and look after, and make the thing turn out the way we want. Just think about it. If you see this world as fundamentally dangerous and threatening, what better way to try to bring matters back into control than attempt to control God through exemplary moral behavior and increased devotion to religious practice and a greater resolve to dogmatic interpretations of Scripture and to criticize everybody who doesn't? Well, sadly for us, in one sense, God is historically, notoriously hard to control. Just doesn't give in to that. And if that is what we're trying to do, to try to get Him to do something for us so control comes back to us, not to Him, it's actually impossible to be a follower of Jesus Christ. You can't do it. You know why? Because you lose your compassion for people. You do it. The lessons of Jesus and what He teaches us and how He encourages us to live with a new worldview seems so ridiculous to us. He comes along in that place where we don't really much care for those that oppose us and see things different to us, and Jesus says, why don't you go love your enemies? Not a chance that's happening. Not if it has to be your way. Pray for those who persecute you, really. Pray what? That they die? No, pray that they be blessed. No, you can't do that. And you can't do it if this is a notoriously dark and dangerous and threatening world, because you're afraid. And fear keeps us from doing that. Here's Jesus' worldview. Peter, we see, cuts off Malchus's ear, and that doesn't work, and then he flees with the rest of the boys. Sandwiched in between is this amazing picture of how Jesus sees the world. In verse 52 it says, he scolds Peter, he says, put away your sword. Those who use the sword, those who have that worldview, they're actually going to die with that same mode. Don't you realize, Jesus said, that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and He would send them instantly? Instead of rebuking those who have come to take Jesus away and kill him, he rebukes his own followers. And what Jesus does is he reaches down, picks up Malchus's ear, restores it, and loves those who have come to arrest him. Is Jesus naive? Like it's just all happiness and balloons and joy? No. Jesus describes this moment as darkness and evil reigning. He's not naive about it. But in the middle of that, you know what his worldview is? My Father's in charge. My Father has this. I could just ask him and he would send 12 legions of angels and they would stop this whole thing. They would. This is not a dark and foreboding and threatening world for us who follow Jesus. It isn't. That doesn't mean we know how it turns out. It doesn't mean the election goes the way we want. It doesn't mean the pandemic is going to be gone in 6 months or a vaccine's going to be here tomorrow. It means none of that stuff. It just means that this is a God-saturated world because he's present here. And that's what makes it God-saturated. And that's who we trust. That's who we rest on. We cannot live by fear. If we are, we give away our worldview that says, God, I don't think you're in charge. I don't think you're bigger than this. I'm not sure you'll do it, or it won't turn out the way I want. And I want to control you to make it happen the way I want. And God says, I'm God, and I'll never give up that throne. This is a good place. It's a place where he's present, and his presence makes it good. You are in the safest possible place right now if you know Jesus and believe he's real and present. You couldn't be in a safer place. Does that mean everything's great and good and, the skids are smooth? No. It just means in this place, whatever it looks like, it's a God-saturated place. This is what Jesus is saying. Don't fight. Don't flee. Don't isolate. Don't take up arms, like verbal arms, and castigate and demean and diminish other people who don't see things the way you do. Don't do it because you have a different view of the world. This is a God-saturated, safe place because he's present. Live that way. Live that way. I did a funeral for a mom of somebody from our church this last week. She had dementia and had that for a number of years and didn't have a lot of contacts left in her world. And so the funeral was her 2 sons and myself. That was everybody. It was an amazing thing to spend time with those 2 brothers, and they each spent time in front of the open casket with their body of their mom there. And they each talked to her as though she was really alive and still there. Both of these men have been through really hard times in their lives, difficult times. They've seen their own challenges and made some mistakes in their world. And the one in particular stood in front of his mom's open casket and said, "Mom, I know I put you through a lot in my life, but you were always there with me. I remember this in particular. I came to you one day, Mom, and I said, it's just not worth it anymore. What I've done, I've messed up so many things, and I've hurt so many people along the way, and I've so disappointed God. And I think I just need to somehow get out of this situation. And Mom, you know what you said to me? You said, maybe you need to stay right where you are because that's where God is, and he's present in that moment. So rather than flee and rather than fight, stay there with him and see what you learn of him." Isn't it interesting? A son at the kind of last memory he shares with his mom is that in spite of her gone and the sorrow of that, in spite of some regrets in his life, what he's grateful for is that someone told him, it's a God-saturated world. You're in a safe place. Stay there. Don't fight it. Don't flee from it. Live in the reality that God is present. You're in a perfectly safe place with him. We must eliminate fear from our lives. How do we do that? Ask ourselves, what is my worldview? Is this a place where God's present? Is it a God-saturated world? And if it is, I can live. You become dangerous. You actually become dangerous for him because you're fearless and you're confident and you're trusting and you're resting. Jesus, would you help us to take a moment, maybe more, to sit with you and learn from you what your view of this world is and what our place in this world is. That because you're present, we have really nothing to fear. Jesus, we are so prone to take the worldview of the world around us. And we lose our compassion, and we lose our care, and we lose our love for our fellow citizens, and especially those who disagree with us. And maybe what we need to do is just sit at your feet. Just sit. And let you shape our mind and our thinking. And let your worldview of a God-saturated world take hold in our lives. Would you do that, Jesus? Amen.